All right. The recording should have just started. Yeah. Before we go on, I want to say hello. Welcome to TCO Pre-Tournament Bootcamp. This is the first session for you guys. It is Introduction to Adjudication. If you supposed to not be in this room, please ask Andrew to reallocate you again. But hopefully you guys are all here for the adjudication, not the speaker one. Speaker one is the other breakout room. I'll ask Andrew to reallocate you if that is the case. All right. Yeah. I think that's all I need to say before we go on. But first, obviously, a little bit introduction about me. My name is Leauren Shiyuan. Usually, you will see this name on tab. So usually when you go to a tournament, you will see my name exactly like this will be on tab, or just Leauren G for short. Sometimes because everyone got confused when you have a long name, so sometimes I also just use the short name. So I started debating at October 2019, so it was just currently a little bit more than 2 years, 2 years and 2 months from now, without any prior experience. So I started when I was in the second year of uni. Before I entering my debating society, I don't know what debating is. I have no idea how debating thing look like and how to actually debate. So basically, I am currently just getting to know debating after 2 years and 2 months. So I have been a career judge. I have judged way more tournament than speaking, although I am currently on my way back to speak at tournaments, but usually I am also seen as a career judge. I have more than 30 judge breaks across the world. I believe now the number is 35. I have also CA'd a few tournaments, but my most notably achievement would be I am a breaking adjudicator at World University Debating Championship in 2021. The Korea one, the most recent one. And I was on the ESL quarters panel. So yeah. And lastly, I came from an EFL background. I presume just like a lot of you guys as well. I am from mainland China, and I'm currently residing in mainland China as well. So I do come from the same EFL background, so I know there are a lot of struggles you guys are going through specifically in the international debating scene right now. And it's very understandable. If you guys want to talk about that, feel free to just message me after. Feel free to find me on Facebook, whatever means you can. I'm very happy to talk about all of this. And also, some people assume that I'm just genius or some sort of like that, but that's actually not the case. I have been training at the first 12 tournaments I have ever attended, so that's approximately 1 year after getting into debating scene. I was still probably training at all the competition I attend, and usually I don't even get promoted, so I'll be just training for 5 rounds straight. And I attended around 20 before my actual first judge break, where I am finally not a trainee, where I'm finally able to break as an adjudicator. So there is a long way before I actually achieve all the breaks you see today. So yeah, that's why basically what I want you to know for the first thing going into the adjudication is that if you try hard enough, there is nothing you cannot achieve, because adjudication essentially is all about practice. Of course, we'll mention a lot of strategy, how to be a good panel, how to be effective at panel discussion, etc. also later on this session, but I think the main thing to help you improve is always practice. Sign up for competitions, talk to the people who are good chairs, talk to people who are good judge. They will always help you to improve yourself, and just if you try hard enough, you will always achieve something. All right. But before we go on to the details of how to judge, I feel like there should be a good recognition of exactly why should you be judging, because I know that you can choose between speakers and judge at this bootcamp. I believe the reason you choose adjudicator, there must be some sort of there must be some reason that you choose the adjudication one, not the speaking one, right? So I think just for the reason, I want you guys to think about like why specifically you want to judge. Try to think about why you prefer judging more than speaking. Sometimes it's probably very simple. I'll outline some of the reasons here, some of the reasons that why I feel like I enjoy judging, but you obviously should think about why you want to judge, because if you're not even willing want to judge, you're not going to be a good judge in the first place, because you cannot do something well unless you truly loves it, right? So here are some reasons that I think that's the reason that helps me to start judging rather than start speaking. I think the first obvious reason that probably most people agree on is that when you're judging, you can probably see a lot of good debates. It's different when you're speaking, because when you're speaking, it's always power pairing. But when judging, when CAs allocate different people, they specifically think about, even if you have no experience, they're more inclined to put you in a good room with a good judge so you can learn more. So there are a lot of things you consider when creating a panel. So specifically when you're as a judge, even if you're a trainee judge, you're probably going to see a lot of good debates. It's very I personally find it fun to see how different people have different opinions and different arguments about one single topic. So some of them you never have even thought about before, and that was probably blowing my mind. And sometimes you do feel like you gained a lot of knowledge after a round as a judge. So you can probably see a lot of good debates and gain a lot of good information. And I think that's inherently a benefit that occurs on judging. The second reason you might want to judge is because judging and speaking are two sides of the same coin. So basically, judging is also a way for you to improve your debate skill. A lot of times people often ask me, how can I improve on my speaking skill? What I always say to my novices in my society as well, I always tell them, try to judge more. Because when you feel like you're in the bottleneck of speaking, it's usually because you don't essentially get what the judges want. So by portraying a role of judge, it's also a great way to see how you were able to improve your speaking skill by using the example of others. You're more able to aware how to make a convincing argument, i.e., why the argument made by this person is probably not so much persuasive to the judges, and how can you improve upon that particular argument to help this to make it much more persuasive than it originally is. So in that way, you can judging is also an essential way of improving your debate skill as well. I have met a lot of great judges, great speakers that start off as a judge. One of the example is one of my best friend, Josh Freeman, who is a semifinalist at Euros. He started as a career judge and just changed to speaking this year and has been able to achieve great achievements because he are able to know that what judges specifically want from him, and he are able to adjust it to speaking. So judging is also a great pavement towards speaking as well. The third reason I think why people judge is that you are also able to learn with people with great minds, because for competitions, specifically if you're able to go to competitions that are large, for example, World University or Pan-African University, chairs are usually the people who are very good, have very good reputations around the globe, and paneling them and just talk to them about debate is essentially a great way to learn from them. So you're able to connect with them, you're able to learn from how they judge, how they think of the debate, so you're able to connect with all the people from great minds. And that essentially is the one reason I started judging as well, is that it helps me connect with a lot of people that I never even dared to dream before. Team Poliage, I know him from training him, and has been a tremendous mentor to me, even now. And yeah, just generally a lot great people you can connect when you specifically start judging. Lastly, a bit guilty pleasure, but it is legit because sometimes as a speaker you might not be like very happy about the judgment of something, but as a judge you can just legitimately pass on your judgment onto something that you can just legitimately say, I don't think they prove this because 1, 2, 3. It does fulfill some sort of guilty pleasure, so you don't have to be secretly thinking someone is bad. You can just directly call out they are bad, and it does fulfill some sort of sense of fulfillment for me, at least. So yeah, so basically those 4 are the reasons why I think I started judging in the first place. But obviously you can have reasons on your own, but I think it's good to think about why you want to judge and what do you want to get out of judging. Even if it's just, I want to practice my listening in English. I'm not currently great at listening right now. I just want to practice listening. That is also a fair explanation on why you want to judge. So just be very clear about what your goal is and what you want to achieve, and subsequently you are then only able to enjoy judging as an activity. And if you don't enjoy it, obviously you wouldn't be so successful in the first place. All right, I think I talked a lot about how to judge, but I think what essentially, because this is a basic introduction, I think what some of you guys need some clarity, but also this is just the foundation of everything we do. It's basically, what is a judge? If you don't understand what even judges do, like, obviously you probably will not understand why we are doing all the things we're going to talk about later. So understanding what is a judge is also a fundamental part to your the whole experience of as a judge. So judges are there to ensure that the debate result is decided by a neutral actor. Means that they're able to deliver a fair result using an agreed set of metric without their own bias. I think this implies a few things that are very important later on. First is that you're neutral. You don't have any preference on either side. So please don't just because, I personally believe that government bench is similar to what I believe currently, so I'm just more inclined to believing government. Don't do that. You're supposed to be neutral. Like, even if you personally believe in government, there is a chance that opposition are able to persuade you otherwise. And I think it's essentially the fun of judging, is that you can change your view on something very drastically before and after a round. So that is, you're a neutral actor. You're there to use an agreed set of metric without your own bias. Is someone drawing on screen? Please don't do that. Everyone can see that. I would assume it's a technical error, but we'll just move on for now. I'll see what I can do later. Here it is. It's good now. No worries. Yeah. So judges are able to make their decision of winning or losing on their own or after a period of discussion. It depends on the format of the debating. In Asian parliamentary, all the judges came to an independent decision, gives independent ballot. In British parliamentary, we often use a term called consensus judging. So basically, consensus judging means that everyone just come together after a period of deliberation. You're able to come to a unanimous decision, decision about the result. Of course, there could be splits, but usually the only result you will see on the tab or directly tell the people is the fact that is a at least a majority result. Um, so essentially what judges, specifically in debating competition, do is they are there to mimic a situation where actual people are watching. So just imagine in real life actual people are sitting in front of the television watching a presidential debate and imagining like which side will be able to persuade more people. So essentially it is about which side can persuade a a neutral person that is willing to be persuaded more. So a judge is there to mimic that situation, although not perfect. Sometimes they have their own bias. Sometimes they probably have way more knowledge than an average individual do, but they are there to mimic that situation so we can decide which side of debate is winning and why. Yeah. So next, this is how usually a round will go for an adjudicator. This is specifically for a British parliamentary tournament. I believe the African circuit usually use British parliamentary as well. Correct me if I'm wrong, but they're like for if you're adjudicated in other format, for example, World Schools, as well as a Asian parliamentary or Australs, that will be essentially different. But this is how a round will go for an adjudicator at a British parliamentary tournament. So first, obviously, any round starts with prep time. That's when team prepares. During this time, take time to relax. Prepare your computer or a pen and paper, depending on how you want to take notes for the next round. The second, after probably 15 minutes, after time is up, everyone gathers around together in the room. So basically, that's when the round starts. So during the round, what you need to do essentially is to take good notes and detailed notes of the round happening, but also trying to actively evaluate between arguments in the first place. So that's what essentially you need to do during the round. There are also other things. For example, chairs should keep the order of the debate, also keep the time of the debate in the first place. But also that's specific to chairs. But generally, what every adjudicators need to do is just take good notes and try to evaluate and come with any initial decision during the round. The next, obviously, the debate ends. Judges will go to deliberation. Sometimes you'll be sole chair, but under most circumstances, you will have a panel, and they will share their thoughts, exchange on the reasons why they believe a particular ranking would go like that, and reach a consensus decision. Of course, sometimes consensus decisions are not reached. They're able to take a vote and able to call it a day. It's also an important part to reminder to not go over time because competitions do need to run on time. Lastly, if it's a close round, that will end up like that. But most rounds should be open round. It will happens within oral adjudication. So basically, chairs need to deliver the results to people if the round is open and explain why specifically the decision came into place in the first place. We'll go over all of these aspects a little bit more in detail later, but specifically, if you're completely new to judging, this is how the timeline of a typical round will look like for you. So let's go into details about every single specific timeline I've mentioned before. So basically, the first happening is obviously speakers are prepping for their cases. You probably, as a judge, have some sort of room to relax. This is time So basically, before you start, the two main thing you need to do is, first of all, obviously, be very relaxed because you're about to concentrate on a debate. Every speech is 7 minutes, and there are 8 speeches. That is 56 minutes of direct concentration. And adding on to like technical difficulties, adding on to things such as such as like the time in between while we're waiting for people, essentially a round will require you to concentrate for 1 hour, if not more. So if you're not relaxed enough, you still going into the round very tired and thinking about other things, it will affect your ability to get accurate notes and come up with an accurate call. So it's very important that you use the time before the actual round starts to actually get relaxed. And the second thing is that don't read into the motion. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but do understand motion. Like don't like do understand every word of the motion, understand what the gov is and what the op is, but don't try to actively think arguments for and against the motion, because the more you think of it, the more you're likely going to be biased in the first place. If you're entering a debate thinking about like one particular group has already persuaded you, it probably means that you're much more likely going to get a very biased result from you. So before I start, just remember to be relaxed and understand the motion, but don't read into the motion. So after the prep-to-lines, the debaters call, obviously there should be the actual debate happening. However, I feel during actual debate, obviously you are expected to take notes, and there are some ways that different people want to take notes. Here are some ideas on how to take notes. There are often people asking like which is the best way to take notes, but I've seen like very good judges use computer. I've seen people with pen and paper get a very detailed note and very accurate recall that are very good judges. So it's essentially up to you. Like some people might worry about like, what if I use computer and I get tired? What if I use pen and paper but not being able to write fast enough? Those are all the concerns that you need to consider. Every person have their own preferences. So basically the 3 ways, main ways, of course, if you want to say that you're going to use the other ways that I haven't been able to think about, that's completely fine. That's completely up to you. So basically, pen and paper are the traditional way of us taking notes. I know in some regions they still ban using computers, so you have to take notes on pen and paper. But usually during like all the majors and specifically like all the competitions, especially when it went online, you still probably should be able to use computer as a way of taking notes. But pen and paper are always the traditional way of taking notes. It might be a bit slow, but a good thing about writing is that when you write down a thing, you're much more likely going to memorize it and process it as any information that you already had. Because when you're typing things, you type probably too fast for even you to even recognize that piece of information is there. But when pen and paper, everything you write down will inherently go into your mind much more concretely, and you're probably able to have thought on it rather than just ignore it. So pen and paper does offer that kind of benefit to you that computer probably cannot. But obviously computer also have their own benefit, namely just you can type a large amount of information in a very short time. You can keep a very detailed notes. Sometimes if the speakers speak fairly slow, you can basically type just everything they said. Although it's not encouraged to do this, but basically what I want to illustrate is just basic fact that when you use computer, you can just type down a lot more information than presumably pen and paper. But the problem with that is obviously it's not probably concise enough. You probably need to do alternative ways to make the information concise enough when it comes to deliberation. We'll talk more about this later. Obviously, the last way is combine. Like, this is probably a very popular way for like a lot of good judges online, is that they are able to write very detailed notes on computer, but they are using the pen and paper for the very core information, i.e. the very, very short summary of what is happening in the round, what is the argument essentially teams make, and why specifically these arguments interact with each other. They use pen and paper for that, so they get a better memory of it and a better recognition of it. All right, so those are the ways to take good notes, but there are also some common features that a good note should look like. I feel like I already mentioned I already mentioned some of these features back at the last slide, but just to reiterate, a good note should be obviously detailed, because without details you wouldn't be able to just see the strengths of a particular argument. Obviously, without details, sometimes you might miss like a very important argument and very important detail. That is probably not the ideal situation in the first place. Second, obviously be logical, because sometimes when a speaker says things, they don't necessarily follow a very logical format. They don't follow like this happens and then that. They probably scatter it around everywhere. But in your notes, it should be noted down in a very logical manner. Be sure to label like, this is the premise of this argument, and from that we can infer that the second thing happened, and from the second thing happened we can infer that this particular impact is reached. So you need to be very actively aware that the notes should look like a very logical thing, because when you format your note in a very logical way, you're able to see whether or not there is a large logical gap in there, or is there any is there enough characterization or enough explanation for a particular argument. So even if the speaker does not necessarily follow a very logical format, really remember to follow a very logical format on your note and try to figure out what the logical of the speaker is on your own when you are taking the notes. And lastly, be concise. You don't have to write down basically everything they say. Sometimes, like, a speaker might have a lot of flashy and flowery language within them. You don't have to note all that down. You can just basically like, minorities harmed. That might be just 2 words for the entire sentence they say. So obviously be concise, because the more you write down, the more you're going to confuse yourself later on. Obviously write down everything that is crucial, but remember to be concise. It makes you much easier to focus on the more important thing later on when it comes to discussion, and don't cram the notes too much. All right, so we're going into a space where debates are happening. As I said earlier, you should probably be actively evaluating arguments. I think this will probably you'll probably get a lot more training in the following days, rather than this is just a very, very, very brief introduction on how to evaluate arguments. So first of all, think of yourself as an average intelligent voter. I'll explain more in detail on how to be an average intelligent voter later on. But this is an absolutely crucial context, because sometimes, like, there is a term for this in debating, it's called interference judging. That is absolutely prohibited. You shouldn't be already biased towards one side. You shouldn't have expert knowledge. The goal for a debate itself is that you are able to persuade the the audience, even if they don't have specific expert knowledge on a particular issue. Second to think about arguments is to think about what does the arguments tell you and what can you believe is the impact after the argument has been done. So basically think about what is the core idea of the argument, and then what is essentially what the world will look like if the argument is true. Are minorities being harmed less? Are everyone economically better off? And just generally things like that. You need to actively try to think of these things as the speaker are trying to make an argument. Lastly, is obviously if you're going to actively evaluate these arguments, you're able to make comparisons. Compare current arguments to the previous arguments, either on their own team or was specifically made by our other teams. Does it have the same level of analysis? Does it clash directly against a particular argument? Does the impact of argument comparatively more plausible or more impactful than the others? Of course, I'll explain all these a little bit more detail later on, but specifically, now you just need to know that you need to compare arguments very actively, even during the round, as the round are happening, because you don't have enough time to do that all in 15 minutes later. You have to actively try to think about these problems while you're judging. But don't be too overwhelmed with that, because usually speakers have a lot of times that doesn't have necessary useful information. So usually you will have enough time to have some room and relax and think about how to evaluate arguments in the first place. But obviously we'll do more detailed explanation later. So, as I said, a very important aspect of judging is that you're an average intelligent voter. Who are they? So basically, the core idea of average intelligent voter is that they don't come from anywhere in particular. I know the usual thing is that please don't assume they come from a Western liberal area with liberal biases. For example, the right-wing media is always bad, but I think sometimes specifically for us who comes from a fairly minority background, also don't assume that everyone just automatically knows what your country is like and what your country is about in the first place. Obviously leave room for people to explain things, and don't assume that they already know the context behind every situation that you're talking about. Specifically, this applies to things in international relationships where things get very interesting, and often people just be much more likely going to be interference. And that is when you should remember that you do not come from any country in particular. You probably don't know the situation in a particular region. Second is that they don't have any technical knowledge. For example, if I'm going to talk to you about my major is statistics, if I'm able to talk about the mathematics implication behind a very complex economic theory, I should be able to not demonstrate in a way using those complex mathematics. I should be able to use it in a way that is much more straightforward for an average people. The rule of thumb is that if something was not taught at school level, that means if something wasn't taught below basically year 12 or age 18, just basically before you go into university, all these things should be regarded as technical knowledge. For example, the word epistemic access is something absolutely no one outside debating will know. Second is the idea of game theory. Absolutely, you can use that, but absolutely explain why game theory applies and what game theory is if you want to use those specific terms. So the voters doesn't know specifically technical knowledge, and the rule of thumb is if it's not taught at schools level, probably that is technical knowledge, and you should expect teams to explain that. If they don't explain that, that probably means that it's their fault. Lastly, Irrata again, they don't have a preference on either side of the debate. It's the easiest way for people to have interference judging. They often make up arguments for particular one side, but absolutely don't. You're a neutral actor. And I think specifically it happens on a very like left-wing ideals versus right-wing ideals debate. Often people are more linked towards left-wing, but we do need to recognize that an average voter probably doesn't care about left-wing too much, i.e. they're probably not communists or they're probably not socialist list. So to that extent, we must be able to, unless we will be able to persuade to them that left-wing is good, we should not just automatically think that left-wing ideals are good. Alright, second, alright, yeah. Alright, next we'll go into detail on how to basically evaluate arguments. So basically there should be 3 sides of the evaluation of the arguments. So first is the strength of analysis, the second is the scale of impact, the third is the interaction. We'll start with the strength of analysis claim. So you need to think of the following things of the strength of arguments. First, have they explained every premise that are required for arguments to work, i.e., did they actually prove this thing in the first place, or did they just claim this thing is true without any actual foundation towards that claim? Second is that have they analyzed the actor's incentive to care about or do certain action? That while we always be like, an example of this would be government. Obviously, government will have financial support towards the poor people. That is a claim. You have to analyze specifically under this motion why specifically governments now have an incentive to actively put more money into these poor people in the first place compared to the status quo, the current world we live in right now, and i.e. why they are able to push more money into these poor people and are able to help them. So you always need to analyze what the active incentive to care about and do certain action in the first place. And the third thing you're going to think about is, are there sufficient analysis on why a particular impact is important and or a large one? If the impact, even if they have a brilliant justification that ended up only impact one person, that probably means that we don't need to care about it too much. If the other arguments about we literally impacting everyone in society. So you also need to note that that is also a part of the strength of analysis, because teams should be able to illustrate how large this particular impact is. So if they fail to do so, that means that the scale of the impact is not very clear. We automatically need to assume that the other side, which gives much clearer impact, much more likely going to have a stronger analysis compared to these kind of things. I just want to note that not saying more words equal to specifically more analysis, and absolutely does not equal to stronger analysis. A lot of people just say this team gives me 7 reasons why that's true. The other team gives 5, so why I think 7 reasons more than 5, and that's why 7 reasons ought to win over 5 reasons. That's not true. Sometimes 7 reasons might be 7 reasons that are not actually very true in the first place, and not very detailedly analyzed why that's particularly true. And that 5 reasons can absolutely be just very crucial, and you cannot find any problems within them that they could absolutely analyze more. If that is the case, there is possibility that the one team have less worth or less analysis that are able to win over the other argument. So basically, the strength of analysis is not dependent on how much you say and how many analysis you have. The rule of thumb is that obviously there are also burdens in terms of the arguments, i.e. if you want to reach a larger impact, you obviously need to do more work. So the rule of thumb is that when you write down the notes, you see that there are specifically logical gaps in there. If a team has like 3 logical gaps, they probably means that their analysis is weaker than the team who have 1 logical gap only, even if that team with 1 logical gap only has a very simplistic justification for it. So to that extent, then remember to think of it in like what they didn't do. If there is more things they didn't do which they should do appear, that probably means that the strength of analysis is weaker. Alright, here is an example of the strength of analysis, because I think it might be quite confusing for some people. So basically, argument A says people will hate the refugees even more because refugees might do bad things, and then people will see it and they will be unhappy. Argument B says that people will hate the refugees more because right-wing media have incentive to paint the refugees in a bad light, and having more refugees means they're more able to utilize this narrative to persuade normal people that refugees have done something wrong. Sorry about this misspelling. And in turn, people are more likely going to have irrational fear towards refugees. Very obviously, argument B is stronger, but I want to explain why specifically argument B is stronger. Because argument A, using the rule of thumb earlier, people hating refugees because refugees might do bad, there is an obvious logical gap here, meaning that A needs to analyze why specifically refugees need to do bad. And then people will see it and they will be unhappy. Argument A probably also needs to analyze why specifically these people have incentive to care about these refugees doing bad things in the first place, and second of all, why these people are going to be unhappy about that rather than actually trying to change that situation to make refugees better. So basically, it's just there are 3 main problems with this argument A, and makes this argument A not very persuadable for a particular person. However, argument B, on the otherwise, doesn't have significant logical gaps. I mean, there are obvious details they can fill, but the idea of having the right-wing media have this incentive to paint the refugees means that it gives normal people an incentive to care about these things, and why having more refugees, even if refugees doesn't necessarily do something bad, they're able to utilize this narrative to persuade normal people, and subsequently just the fact of having more refugees alone will probably in turn cause the refugees to be in a much worse place in the first place. So basically, that's the reason why argument B is stronger, not because argument B has more words, but specifically because argument B explained how they reach every single step and how they derive that this impact is true. Of course, in more complex and better debates, argument B is not perfect. There are many other ways to refine this argument B, but specifically during a normal discussion, an average person probably find argument B already enough persuadable without any very obvious gaps, unless there are other teams calling that out. So that is all about the strength of the argument. However, a lot of times, like, the strength of the arguments is probably the same, because obviously at a competition it always power paired, so basically people with some abilities, specifically in later rounds, will be paired into similar rooms, and to that extent you probably don't necessarily see that they will have a strong ability difference, and their analysis is probably, the strength of analysis is probably more or less similar to others, so you don't necessarily see a significant difference in them. So now how you do evaluate them? You need to evaluate on scale of impact. This includes probably 3 aspects. First is the range of the impact. Does it only a few people, or does it affect everyone? If the argument is similarly analyzed, we obviously would incline to prefer the argument that affects more people. For example, economically better for everyone compared to just a few people getting benefited from the environment policy. see, we obviously prefer the one with much more people affected and much more people that are going to benefit from it. The second is need. Do the argument cater to the most vulnerable groups of people, or do people affected has essentially no alternative? So basically, sometimes even if with a slightly larger range, for example, again, if economy, if it is better off for a little bit for everyone in economy, but if the environmental side, even if there are less people, but these people will have absolutely no alternative, i.e. they will just be harmed to the extent they aren't able to find a way out, they aren't able to reach the economic benefits that the other side that are talking about. Obviously these people are very vulnerable to this particular policy, and that's why we give them incentive to care about them. So it's also a thing about need. The third thing, which I think a lot of people probably does not tend to think about but should think about more is likelihood. Is it certain that this case is happening, or is it just under the best case or under the worst case? For example, if economic benefits only happen under the absolutely best case of the government, that in most circumstances the economic benefit probably doesn't even occur. If the environmental harm is certain, 100% going to happen, we probably prefer to have less economic benefit because we are unsure about that economic benefit compared to a harm that certainly we are going to bite. So the likelihood of the impact happening is also a reasonable metric to think about the scale of impact. Then I want to talk more about engagement, because it is obviously very much linked to the scale of impact, because obviously rebuttals and weighings can affect average intelligent voters' view on the scale of impact itself. How do I go back? Sorry. Yeah. So basically there are two forms of engagement exist. First is obviously direct rebuttal. Think the following things. Is the rebuttal directly targeted towards the logic of the particular argument? If the rebuttal is true, does the argument fall apart? Or is there alternative reasons for us to believe that argument is true? I.e., if there are 3 reasons that government thinks that's true, if opposition comes, if one of the reason is wrong, there are still 2 other reasons we believe that we'll still reach that probably scale of impact. So that is, so think about this, about whether or not this rebuttal is directly towards the basic logic of the argument, or does these only target specific instances and specific analysis of the argument. If the rebuttal is true, does the argument fall apart? If the argument basically is that if the rebuttal is true, thus the argument does not work at all because their logic just inherently fall apart, or is or is there other reasons for us to believe that is true? And on the scale of impact, does the rebuttal mitigate the argument or completely turn the argument around, or basically effectively do nothing? Sometimes rebuttals can be non-effective as well, depending on the ability of the speaker and persuasiveness of the rebuttal themselves, of course. But basically, it means that the rebuttal, if it is mitigatory, means that the benefit of harm of the other side still appears, but just not as large as they wish to. However, there are some rebuttals that are able to completely turn the argument around, i.e. showing that their benefit actually happening on your side, or their harm actually happens on their side in the first place. So that is all about rebuttal. And second, for weighing, ask yourself, is there enough reason to believe that weighing is true? I.e., is there any explicit weighing in the round for me to believe that we should buy this metric? If the team just say that you should apply this metric because you care about environment more, then it's probably not stands, because I need to know the reasons why I need to care about environment more. compared to economics, right? So you also need to think about whether they actually justify this particular weighing in the first place. Do both sides agree on this weighing, i.e., do both sides explicitly agree that we should value this weight on the matter of economics, or is there a different metric that applies to both sides that both sides claim is true, i.e., government might claim that this debate is about economics, opposition might claim this debate is about environment, then you need to use the knowledge I illustrated earlier on which side probably tells you the reason why you specifically need to care about it more, to actually think about debates very actively. So that is on how to evaluate arguments on the basis of engagement. If you feel all these information are overwhelmed, don't be worried. We'll do just quick recap, and hopefully this is only introduction. You still have the following week to probably practice about it. So evaluate argument, there are some tips about it. Don't be overwhelmed by all these methods. It becomes very fast and very intuitive once you have more experience. For me, I can usually done it just literally during the time where I say I would like to thank the speaker, now I would like to invite DPM. So basically it can be very, very fast once you get used to it, so don't be overwhelmed. But at first it can be a bit slow for people, but it just needs time to get adjusted to that. And second of all, sometimes there's no definitive answer on how to evaluate arguments, because people necessarily prioritize different things. Even if the average intelligent voter, ordinary average intelligent voter, people believe average intelligent voter care about different things all the time. For example, I probably prioritize environment. I probably prioritize minority rights. Some people inherently believe, the average intelligent voter probably care about economics more. People do prioritize different things. The only thing you need to come up is with a reasonable evaluation, i.e., your reason is logical for us for you to make the decision that opening opposition is win over opening government, for example. And you're able to proceed with others to discuss about your thoughts on the debate to see whether or not you change your minds or not. Lastly, is always remember to see the positive of the arguments presented. I know I talked a lot about seeing the logical gaps between them. That is absolutely true. You need to do that, but always remember there should be positive side about it. Don't try to be too negative on the arguments presented, because at the end of the day, essentially what British parliamentary judging is a positive judging. We do not discredit others for material that they didn't say, but we reword whatever word they say. And that specifically happens when you're not in a very specifically very, very skilled rooms, when you're judging novices, etc. Always remember that it's just about different levels. Even if one team has a lot of logic gap, they might still win over others. So always remember to see the positives and argument presented as well. So just a quick this is so obviously judging you need to be comparative. All the things I said before are about to be comparative. This is just a quick summary of how to be comparative. These three questions are probably you need to ask once you get more used to the judging aspect of the competition. The first question you probably want to ask yourself is that how does a particular argument interact with arguments from other teams? There's no such thing as an automatic winning argument. Just because a particular argument is good does not mean that they can necessarily win over arguments from other teams that might also be good, also be very persuasive, and might be more on clash or have a larger scale impact. So always remember there's no winning argument. Just because our argument is good doesn't mean that they're particularly winning in the first place. Second, do the team respond to other arguments? Do they completely disapprove of others' arguments, or is it mitigate to their harm, or they did just not respond at all? Just because some team does not respond to a particular argument doesn't mean that that particular argument is not relevant in debate. In fact, that's probably have higher relevance in the debate, because that means that one side just basically concedes that is going to happen. So basically, be more aware of that and just realize if an argument was not responded, you also need to take that argument into consideration, and probably that argument's probably also in full effect in the first place. Lastly, ask yourself, have the team provided a reason why their arguments are the most important during the debate? Weighing is obviously the most important thing within the debate, explicitly or implicitly. Just because you feel like a particular impact is well proven and large does not mean that they necessarily are the most important ones that are agreed by the debaters during the round. If there is an explicit metric on how you should judge debate, always actively try to apply that metric instead of using the intuitive justification rather than your intuition in the first place. So now that we're saying a lot about how to evaluate on arguments, and those things are probably you should do during and directly after the debate has ended, and then now the next thing judges obviously will do is that they will enter the deliberation. So this is essentially what happens in regular BP rounds on deliberation as well. So during first 1 or 2 minutes, the chair might say, okay, take your time. We'll just take 1 or 2 minutes of your time. We'll just go through your notes once again to double check if there is anything you missed, if there is any question you want to resolve. Come with an initial call, and we'll just discuss later. So basically, this period, look over your time and come with an initial call. Don't worry if you cannot come with a full call. Just a very, very brief idea on how debates should proceed, and give a chair an idea on how to lead the discussion in the first place would be enough. You don't necessarily have to say, okay, I definitely have OG beating O, but you can have I feel like OG is beating O on these grounds, I feel O is beating OG on these grounds, I'm not really sure right now. Now, that's completely fine. But during this period, you need to look over your notes and actually trying to think about the things that basically all the things you said earlier on whether or not a team should beat other teams or not. Then it will be move on to discussion on specific clashes, for example, OG versus OO, CG versus OG. Discuss why the reasons you put this particular result. Exchange information on that result. Did you miss something during the debate, or is there anything you haven't noticed while you're taking down notes, etc. Exchange those information helps all the judges on panel to have a better idea on what exactly debate should look like, and discuss whether or not you're willing to believe that one team is over to the other. And obviously at this point of time, the judges should be more willing to be persuaded. If you have more new information that are able to change your mind, you should also be willing to be persuaded in the first place. The third step, if after a fairly long time period of discussion, for example 15 minutes, you still haven't reached a consensus decision, obviously there will be a vote. Only the majority decision will come into place, i.e. if you're in a minority, for example, if 2 people on the panel believes OG are over OO and you still believe OO are over OG, you can call a vote and this will cause a split, but only OG over OO, the result of the majority, will be reflected as the actual result of the debate in the first place. So that is when the vote happens. And lastly, after the vote, you will be required to do speaker scores, so judges will decide the speaker score for individual speakers. The speaker scores should only be decided by the majority of the panel, but obviously most of the time the case is that the chair will obviously include people who are in minorities into the decision of deciding speaker scores, because obviously their logic and incentive, their logic and reasoning are probably also important in deciding whether or not a speaker should get a high score or not. During deliberation, There are a few things I want to note. Specifically for most of you, I believe most of you will. I mean, I do see some very, very accomplished judges here, but I think specifically for most of you, probably you will start as a panelist or even trainee. That during that time during deliberation, your what you should do doesn't necessarily change. Those are the following aspects that you probably need to follow if you want to be a good panelist, if you want to be scored high as a panelist. First is be accurate. If a chair asks you what's the OG and OS comparison, don't actively trying to bring CG or CO's material in. When I chair, I often hear when I ask like, what's your idea on the government bench, why you put CG over OG, they often bring up a lot of material from opening opposition, closing opposition, try to claim that closing government does a fairly more job in responding to OO, or why are they more responsive to OO's material. That is not how you should judge. If I'm talking about the government bench, you should only specifically focus on why CG are able to take over OG by their own material. Of course, rebuttal matters, but unless that rebuttal is also a significant part of a team's particular contribution, don't actively trying to bring in them into the deliberation. So only mentions the thing that actually matters. Don't try to bring things that the chair doesn't ask you, because as illustrated on slides, whatever CG or CO said should probably be independent from the decision that you make for opening government, opening opposition, and that is true for every single clash. Second of all, be concise. Usually the deliberation will only last 15 to 20 minutes. If you spend 5 minutes recapping everything a team has said, by the time deliberation, if you spend like 5 minutes recapping everything single team have ever said, that means that you basically just spending 35 minutes recapping the whole debate, which is probably not necessary, because every judge on the panel essentially already listened to debate, has their notes, knows what debate is happening. So only outline the most important reasons and only elaborate when you need to. Only elaborate when the chair say, okay, can you give me more specific on your notes on this particular argument? What do you feel like they specifically prove about this? Only during that time elaborate, but usually you can only just say, OG's argument's idea is this, but I don't think that's particularly persuasive because this, and OO's material is much more persuasive because of this, and that's essentially why I put OO over OG. And that probably should be enough. Like, that probably doesn't cost you more than 2 minutes to explain one particular clash. And then only elaborate when you need to. Obviously, another thing during deliberation to be reminded to is be open-minded. Be ready to be persuaded by others, because I think a lot of times the panels often end up in a meta debate where it's essentially about chair and wings arguing about why specifically a debate is true and basically defending their own opinions. Don't do that. Be very open-minded. If after listening to their logic, you now have more insights on the debate, you now think, okay, maybe it is true that OG takes over OO. Be ready to change. But obviously don't change just because the others have said things. Be very specific about it and tell people why you're changing. For example, I would say, OO said this, or I originally don't think enough because of this. Now after you said that actually has more justification towards this thing, and specifically OG probably doesn't have enough analysis on this thing, I'm probably willing to go go to believe that O's argument is actually stronger than OG's, and that's why I'm willing to flip. So be very be very open-minded, willing to be persuaded, either your chair or your wing, but obviously still be reasonable. Don't just change because you fear that chairs will punish you for not changing. That is not the case. As chairs, we only care about your logic in the first place. We don't care about if you split, to be fair. And lastly, don't be stubborn. Even if you're not persuaded, that's completely fine. That often happens. Be ready to move on, because deliberation essentially there are only 15 minutes. After specifically 5 to 6 minutes, you feel like every detail between two teams are kind of already explained, but they're just different metric applies to different judges. Be sure to willing to move on and just call it a split. Actively trying to tell the chair that I'm okay with splitting on this. I see your reasoning, but I still believe that my reasoning is correct. Be respectful about it, but obviously don't be too stubborn and unwilling to let go unless you are able to persuade the others. All right. So basically, I believe for most of you, things should end there. For most of you who are for panelists, basically things just end there. If you're a chair judge, there are obviously still more you need to do. Specifically for open rounds, oral adjudication will happen. I'll just say it. I'll just abbreviate it as OA for now, just so that it doesn't take much time for me to speak it. Okay. Speakers obviously deserve to know what the ranking is and deserve to know why they win or why they lost. So OA is essentially for that. OA is often delivered by chair, but sometimes if the chair doesn't feel well enough that they are able to deliver a well-rounded summary for the panel, a wing can volunteer under that circumstances. That specifically usually happens when a chair gets outvoted on a clash, i.e., if chair believes O are over OG, but two wings believe OG are over OO. At this point, chair probably is not the best person to deliver the oral adjudication because they will probably find it very hard to justify OG over OO when they do not even themselves believe in it. So at that time, a wing can volunteer to deliver the oral adjudication instead. However, that is not mandatory, and chair cannot force wings to deliver the oral adjudication. But usually, sometimes wings are able to. Sometimes at least one wing are willing to come up and say, "Hey, I'm going to do the oral adjudication instead of you because we feel like that I probably represent the panel more." And obviously, how to deliver a good OA. Be detailed. Remember to mention the core ideas of argument. All the arguments presented in the round. Don't just mention one particular thing, even if that one particular thing is the most important and affects the decision. Do mention all other cases and explain why specifically they are not as important as the team might think. So be very detailed on that regard. And second of all, be precise. Outline the main reason why a team loses to the others. However, don't put too much irrelevant information in there. So be very clear about this is what you said and that's why, and these are the reasons we think it's good or it's not good enough. But don't bring in too much personal thought into this. Don't put too much. I would say essentially say feedback on what you think, how this argument can be developed further, etc. Those you can leave for personal feedback if they came to find you. Also, be concise. That is the same when you're doing panel discussion. In the OA, you don't have to do a whole recap of the debate you're happening. Just explain the core idea of argument and what part affects the judge's evaluation. Don't just simply repeat what they say. Actively trying to tell them this is this is probably the reason we believe that it's not enough. That's probably enough in a lot of times. Don't try to say this detail probably doesn't work because ABCD. The other detail doesn't work because ABCD. That is probably going to take way too long for your OA to even finish. Lastly, and also I think the very important thing is to be confident, because you are there to deliver essentially the result. You need to persuade the people that you are right, the decision come into place, because obviously sometimes people know they lost, but a lot of times people all believe they win because people are entirely optimistic. So be confident about yourself. If you are not confident about your decision in the first place, like, it's just not gonna sound very persuasive to people, and people are just gonna doubt your decision even more. So be confident about your decision in the first place. Lastly, I think this is the last thing I'll mention because I do need to go after this. I don't need to take the full 2 hours because I think all of these should be suffice for a introduction. Obviously, the rest of the facilitators will have more detailed exercise for you, but I think just for introduction, there's no need for me to provide any exercise as well, so you're just free to go after I've done with this slide. So basically, lastly, it's just after a round, what should you do, what should you do as an adjudicator? Basically, 2 things. First is ask other judges, speakers you trust for feedback. Not even the judges and speakers you trust, but just essentially everyone for feedback, specifically your chairs, because they are probably the more experienced judges. And most chairs you see are probably like me, who also experienced a lot, and knows what you're struggling through when they're experience a lot what you're struggling through and your problem in the first place when they are a panelist or trainee. So you can also request feedback from people you trust as well, and obviously those feedbacks are often tremendously helpful for you to judge in the future competitions and are able to improve yourself. Again, I have to mention Tin here. Like, Tin has given me a lot of useful feedbacks when I was a trainee, tell me how to actively try to change my judging style, and those still affects how I judge today. And so essentially getting feedback is the same as when you're a speaker. And the second thing is obviously relax, because judging is hard and sometimes you do feel burnout after every single round, because as I said, the whole process takes about 1 hour and a half. So you will just absolutely be drained out after, especially if you're a chair and you have to deliver only, and afterwards speakers have to find you for personal feedback, etc. So use the time in between to relax a bit more. Don't read into your performance too much. Don't worry too much about your performance. If you've done good, that's nice. If you are not doing that good, the more important thing is to have feedback and improve yourself. Just even for me, like, I have a lot of times where I'm worried about my performance, but usually that doesn't matter, because if you have done something bad, you can just be better next time, and there are always room for you to improve, even if for the best judges in the world. Like, even for me, I have times where I feel like, this is something I haven't noticed before, this is something I need to improve on. So don't read into your performance too much. It might be due to a lot of things. You might just enter the circuit, you might be very sleepy today, you might not be in the mood for judging today. There are all sorts of reasons. Don't read into the performance too much, and just hope for the best for the rounds beyond. Well, yeah, so basically those are the core ideas, I would say, for an adjudicators to move. That is essentially a sort of brief introduction to how to become a good adjudicator. I don't have any specific plans for later on, so I guess I'll just end